I am the lead pastor here at Watershed. I'm so glad that you're here. This is week 2 of a series that we've entitled Signs and Wonders, Breaking the Binaries. You and I, we have a particular type of conditioning. You may not be aware of this, but we are conditioned more often than not to separate, to divide, to split between the spiritual and the material, the secular and the sacred, the personal and the political. And in Jesus, if you begin to notice how Jesus shows up into the world, liberation is a little more complex. In fact, liberation, it could be said, is found often at the intersection of some of the binaries that I just mentioned. And so this morning, as we move into the second week of this, I want to try to point to some of the complexities. I want to try to point to some of the binaries and see where that might lead us together today. And the way I want to do this is I want to dive into a story that I just can't seem to shake after, I don't know, three decades of trying to make sense of my spirituality this way. It's found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. Maybe you're familiar with this story, but it's about Jesus traveling across this lake to engage a person that's really distraught, really kind of beside themselves. And it begins with Jesus and his disciples went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. So we are 14 words in and already a lot going on here. Whole bunch of stuff. Prior to this chapter, the first 4 chapters, Mark goes out of his way to name specific places and locations to which Jesus would travel and teach or heal. So he named Sabbath in Capernaum and Jerusalem in Galilee. In fact, there should be a map at some point that pops up and it kind of shows you what region to the east of this, there it is, to the west rather of this Lake Galilee. This is all the locations to which Mark is pointing to. That the east side is not the same as the west side. And for Jesus to leave the west and go to the east, it was a big deal. It had a lot of symbolic implications. On the west side of this lake, which is the Sea of Galilee, it's the same thing, is his tribe, his culture, his routines, its Sabbath, its temple, its Torah. All of the normalcy of what it meant for him to be a part of his community was on the west side. On the east side, a whole different world. It was called the Decapolis, and it was actually 10 cities that were sort of represented in the Decapolis. Alexander the Great, several years prior to this story, had come into this region and had done all of this work, violent work per se, to turn that part of his world into what it meant to be Greek. And so it was oriented around education and sport, the indoctrination of emperor worship and the worship of Greek gods and goddesses. And so on the west side, it was a very particular world. And then on the east side, where Jesus and his students would have been living or grown up, it was a very particular world, again, with purity codes and Torah and so on and so forth. And so to go to the other side was like literally going to a different world. It was like going to a different planet. On the other side, you run the risk of being ceremonially unclean. It's avant-garde. It's often violent and dangerous. If you left to go to the other side, you were leaving safety and comfort and predictability. You were embracing at worst, like violence, and at best, a good grounding from your parents if you went to that side. It's like, don't go over there or else you're grounded kind of thing. And so when Jesus says, let's go to this other side, it's huge. It's a big deal. Spirit often takes you to new places and new spaces, doesn't it? Now, when I use that word spirit, I know there's a lot in the room for some folks. Some hear universe, some hear the divine or God or Christ consciousness. Spirit, though, however you decide to frame it, will often use curiosity, won't it? It'll use discomfort. In fact, that's how many of you ended up in this place this morning, right? Like there was some sense that the old order of things, it just stopped working. And you weren't really sure what to do about the way your tribe or your group insisted that you believe or behave, and it started to lose energy, or you just started to drift in a different direction. Maybe there was a restlessness, a prodding to leave the region or that group to journey somewhere else. The tipping point sort of started to take place, right? Like the risk of staying felt greater than the risk of going, right? Like there was too much to lose if you didn't at least go and try to understand what was in the other side. Developmental scientists and theorists tell us that new stages of growth and consciousness are always about expansion. To accommodate greater depth, inclusion, complexity, and nuance often means becoming honest about the limitations of our space or our place. And so in that regard, liberation is often about capacity, which can be really scary, right? Really disorienting. By the way, shameless plug here. If you're in Preface, get ready, because this is a little bit of a preview for what's going to happen Wednesday night. And if you've never been through Preface, this is some of the stuff that we talk about. Moving right along, though. If it matters, and this hopefully would be endearing, like even Jesus went through this. Jesus experienced it. It wasn't until his mid-30s or early 30s actually, but at some point he just couldn't stay in the same neighborhood. Hence this story. He couldn't continue to just live within the same narrow tribal religious context of his day. He had to go. The Spirit came calling, and he had ears to hear and eyes to see. His wineskins were flexible. Hence he went. This is an artist rendition of the first century Emperor Vespasian. The Gerasenes, this region that Mark is describing here, was also the site not just of the Decapolis being formed, but a really violent, dark event prior to this story being told. And it's actually recorded through the Roman historian Flavius Josephus. It's in a work called War 4. I think there's 7 volumes of this. You can actually read about them online if you're interested. But in chapter 9, Josephus writes, "And now Vespasian have fortified all the places round about Jerusalem, and erected citadels at Jericho and Adida, and placed garrisons in them both, partly out of his own Romans and partly out of the body of his auxiliaries. He also sent Lucius Annius to Gerasa," which is the Gerasenes, "and delivered to him a body of horsemen and a considerable number of footmen." So envision massive military occupation flooding into this region. And it says, "So when he had taken the city, which he did at the first onset," apparently didn't take him long, "he slew 1,000 of those young men who had not prevented him by flying away. But he took their families captive and permitted his soldiers to plunder them and their effects. After which he set fire to their houses and went away to adjoining villages," to continue to do this sort of thing. "And while the men of power fled away and the weaker part were destroyed, and what was remaining was all burnt down." A scorched earth effect. This is what the empire did. In some instances, this is what the empire will do. It's occupation, it's vicious, it's violent, it's submit or die. It's peace at the end of a sword. And so when Jesus says, "Hey, let's go to the other side," there's all the stuff that would be disrupted because you were Jewish, but there was also moving into a region where the lingering effects of trauma and loss still existed. This is what they were stepping into, and you can only imagine how much loss and trauma there would have been. We're insulated here in the Western world to some extent, right? Like, we're not exempt from it. Make no mistake. In fact, this coming Thursday evening on the 8th, there's a documentary that's being shown here. I think David might have mentioned it, but it tells the story of a lesbian hate crime, namely the murder of Talana Krieger. And it's the story how this sort of violence can happen right here in our own backyards. And you don't have to even watch the documentary to know that there are structural, systemic reasons for why people who are marginalized or othered end up being the brunt of such violence. But at a personal level, when you go through trauma, when you go through great loss, whether you realize it or not, and often you do, it just wrecks you. You know, it leaves you trapped a lot of times inside of yourself, like second guessing everything, second guessing your feelings, overthinking, being mentally exhausted, emotionally drained, crippled by despair, numb. That's the story of this region. That's the thing that had been done to these people because of the Roman war machine that crushed everything in its path, leaving all kinds of devastation and trauma. This is where Jesus was traveling to. Verse 2. We're only into verse 2. I promise it's not going to be this long for the other verses. Verse 2, when Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. Man, what a spooky, mysterious story, isn't it? But when you kind of zoom out a little bit, it's interesting because here Jesus enters this region. It's been bludgeoned by the empire. He's greeted by this man who is under the oppression of an evil spirit or evil spirits. And when you start to juxtapose those two realities and you know all the history, it starts to make you wonder, like, who's Mark really talking about here? Is this a story about a man? Or is he talking about something more sinister? Something more related to empire and its occupation? Is this story about a person, or is this about the political? It's like he's showing us a picture of what happens to our insides when our outsides are put under so much duress. If you've ever been in a situation close to this, or just marginally toxic or brutal, you know what I'm talking about, right? It feels like you're losing your mind. The stress is so overwhelming. It's these questions you can't shake, like, why is this so hard? Why can't I seem to let go? What's wrong with me? Why can't I get past it? Why can't they get past it? When will it end? How much longer is this going to go on? Will it ever? Why? It's painful to go through those experiences. It's also really painful to watch. It's like there's this internal dimension, but there's also this external dimension to his misery and to ours. You have this horrible situation at work that just doesn't seem to be able to end. There's no solutions. You're in a relationship that's toxic, but you're being blamed. You're being called the problem. You've been trapped in a family or a religious system that's been abusive or neglectful. Maybe you're waking up to the political, the judicial, or the economic systems that exploit, systems that scapegoat or weaponize or justify violence. These are external dimensions that carry an internal price. Not only that, but like when all of this is happening, like, how do I speak out against some of these things, right? What does it mean to speak up or to speak out? You want to resist. You want to come to the defense of the defenseless or yourself. But there's risk in that as well, right? There's risk of alienation. What will my family think? What will my church think? What will the people at work think? There's risk of termination or attack. And depending on who you are, how far you're willing to take it, or where this is all happening, there's even the risk of violence or incarceration or death. And then there's the converse side of all this too, right? Like not speaking up. There's an internal cost for that as well. Like you stuff it and you push it down. It starts to eat you from the inside out. This is what Jesus is stepping into with his disciples. This is what the people of Gerada faced every single day. Resist, protest, speak out, disrupt, and the machine will mow you down. Suppress it, bottle it, and it might have you wandering the forest, stark raving mad. It says in verse 6, when this man saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" And a footnote here, This phrase, Son of the Most High God, that's actually a phrase of endearment or honor that was only reserved for Roman emperors of that day. And so the Spirit in this man says, in God's name, don't torture me. For Jesus had said to him, come out of this man, you impure spirit. And then Jesus asked him this chilling question, what is your name? Who are you? So in this region, who has ultimate authority? Who uses their authority to kill, maim, torture? The empire, right? But here, this spirit is submitting to a different authority. It was used to submitting to this other authority. Now it's submitting to this new authority. It's like Mark is showing us this power being flipped. It's Mark and Jesus saying, all right, we've always thought we knew who had the last word, but who really has the last word here? The empire, Caesar, violence, power, destruction, or is it something else? Liberation is about authority. When you're bound up, it's because something else is in charge. Something else is in control. And until you can name that something, naming the authority, or name the authority, until you can do that, the pursuit of liberation, it feels like you're circling the block in a neighborhood where you're lost and you're trying to find a house with no address. It's that frustrating. But then all of a sudden, what happens when clarity arises, when the diagnosis comes, or there's honesty about the addiction or transparency about the abuse, or you're able to actually name the structures and the systems at work. When this happens, the power flips, right? The shift starts to take place. There's relief. There's a breakthrough. Jesus asks him, what is your name? And he replies, my name is Legion, for we are many. And Legion is a military term for usually 1,000 or so soldiers. And it says he begs Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, send us among the pigs. Allow us to go into them. It says Jesus gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, then rushed down the steep embankment into the lake and were drowned. Wow. What drama, right? Like if you're a first century teenager hearing this story being told, it's like, where is the popcorn, man? This is amazing. But also, like, there's an escalation of tension here. There's a confrontation, right? Such that when Jesus asks the spirit its name, the spirit responds with a military term, at which they then submit to a different authority. And then when Jesus uses that authority, he does what? He casts the spirits into the abyss, into the water. By the way, where in the scriptures do we read of a story where an evil regime, an empire, is drowned in a large body of water? What's the first story ever told in the Bible? The Exodus, right? Moses. And you can see Mark is pointing to a story that this isn't the first time a story like this has been told. What's holding you down? What system, what reality makes you feel like you have a boot on your neck? What's leading you to despair? What is it? Does it have the last word? Does it get the last word? Because in this story, we see a Jesus reminding us that systems of violence and power are temporal. They're passing. They may not feel that way. They may feel like a Mount Everest moonshot reality. But Jesus is saying whatever is right in front of us, that boss that's cruel, that government or governor or local leader who is hell-bent on ruining your life, that group determined to whitewash your history or vilify your existence or preserve the status quo. It is easy It is easy to think that authority structures we are under are just too much, too massive, too indestructible. But when it crosses into despair and disempowerment or futility, when we lose the will to resist, we've actually lost the liberation that Jesus came to enact. The empire, it crushes, it kills, it destroys. But in this story, we see a Jesus who comes to enact a different way of ordering the world. A way where the sick are healed, the hungry and the poor are fed and clothed, and the captives are set free. A way of being that he describes not as the kingdom of Caesar, but the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. The world the empire creates, it slaughters thousands, levels villages, pillages families, burns homes to the ground. But in this story, we see a Jesus who insists that whatever is holding us down is temporal. It's passing. It's finite. It's stampeding down the hill. Oppression is drowning in the water. It's becoming extinct. And this is a Jesus worth following, y'all. This is a Jesus worth raising your hand and going, all right, this is the direction I want my life to move. A Jesus who's willing to confront and liberate whatever or whoever needs to be set free. A Jesus who disregards any and all religious boundaries, who says, I'm going to go wherever the Spirit leads. And so, friends, when you find yourself caught up in some sort of resistance or struggle, thinking this is the last word, Jesus comes to liberate us from the lie that says, well, that's just the way it is. And this is the way that it always has to be. Verse 14. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside. And so the people went out to see what had happened. And when they found Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. But the man was sitting there dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. You mean, like, how about amazement? How about inspiration? How about encouragement? Nope. Total fear. It says those who had seen this went and told others what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and they told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Liberation is disruptive, right? Both for those who are watching it and those who are experiencing, I would argue. It's like you spend years believing and behaving in all these right ways. You're mirroring the people around you, right? You're reflecting a lot of attitudes and beliefs of your family, of your religious community, the people at work, the folks on your street. And then something happens, right? You hear something you can't unhear. You see something you can't unsee. You are loved and validated, befriended by someone that you were told you should hate and judge. And then something starts to die. It's a good death for the record, but you start to abandon things you thought you would always need, and you embrace ideas and people that you were told you should reject or fear. And all of a sudden, it's like this freedom starts to flood into your life. But then what happened? Like the moment you finally found the courage to articulate this to the people that matter the most to you in your life, you're the most free, you're the most alive, and what was the response? At best, a blank stare. At worst, criticism, confrontation, exclusion, vilification. It was like the exact moment that you knew you were the most free. There were people in your life that wanted things to stay exactly the way they'd always been. Liberation can be disruptive. Verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how God has had mercy on you. And so the man went away and began to tell all of those in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. This story, oh my gosh, this story. This man, he has this Jesus, come to Jesus moment, like literally has this come to Jesus. That's not like, that's real right here. He's all juiced up. He feels completely liberated, and he wants to follow Jesus. He wants to do the thing that we grew up telling everybody, this is what you should do. And he wants to enlist, like, come on, I want to be a part of the team. And Jesus is like, I don't think so. Maybe not. I got a different idea. Go back to your village. What? Yeah, go back to your, you're not going back across the lake to us with us. You're going to stay here. Go back to your village. Tell everybody what the Lord has done. And he's like, wait a minute, what just happened here? Like, I got no training. I haven't gone through, I don't have education. I don't have any experience. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll be completely lost. And he says, nope, go. Face the struggle, face the insecurity, the uncertainty, tell your story. I trust you. You can do this. For years, you, possibly, we're taught that we're supposed to believe in Jesus. But in a story like this, and countless other stories, if you have the eyes to see them in the scriptures, we see a Jesus who believes in the people around him, believes in them, believes in us, believes in you, believes in me. And this too, a little bit later, Mark, a little later on, Mark begins to describe Jesus coming back to the region. And as soon as he gets out of the boat, it's like a Taylor Swift concert. Like everybody's just like, Team Jesus. Where does all this come from? It says throughout the whole region, people carried their sick to wherever they heard Jesus, and they begged him to let them touch even the cloak, the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. How did so many people know about all of this? Who had been describing what was true? I think would appear that a man formerly known as Legion had been a little busy, right? Telling his story, trusting, believing in himself, telling his liberation story. Which brings me to us this morning. What is your liberation story? I don't know if I got a liberation story. Do you? Maybe you do, you just don't realize it. Or maybe you're in the course of writing it. Maybe that's a fairer question. Like, what chapter are you in? Let's drill it down to that granular level. Maybe you're in the let's go to the other side chapter, right? You're in the process of leaving, embarking towards something new. Maybe you're in the I'm circling the block chapter. I'm trying to figure out, like, what just happened. I'm on the backside of struggling in the aftermath of fill in the blank. Maybe you're in the what's your name chapter. It's time to name the authority that's been holding power over me chapter. Is it personal? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it relational? Is it historical? Is it generational? What keeps you circling the block looking for a house with no address? What is its name? What is its name? Maybe it's a chapter on belief. And this is going to maybe be a bit disruptive or hard to hear, but I think it needs to be said. Sometimes belief of or belief in Jesus can become one giant crutch. Like so much so that it excuses you from having to face your fear. It gives you an opting out experience of not going on a journey, or not having to take responsibility for choices, or not having to go home and tell your story. And I guess what I'm trying to say in all this is, if it's true that Jesus believes in you, then maybe the most powerful, transformative chapter of your story to write would be the one where you start to believe in yourself. What's your liberation story? So on our website, there's this tab, and if you click it, somewhere it says belief. And when you go to that part of our web page, you see our mission. Watershed is a community awakening, struggling, and loving as though a different world is possible today. But then below that, you see three things. Three things. You see language around transformation, language around reclamation, and language around liberation. And I don't know if he's in the room right now, but David Roberts, who for the past 5 years has been helping us create language around what it means to be us. He probably spent 8 or 9 months with our staff and several other folks here going, what does liberation mean? And the fruit of that labor is the statement that exists on our website. And it's one of the most powerful things that I think's ever been created here in this community. And I was trying to figure out what's a way that we could end this morning. You know, should I just read that, or maybe just pray, or, you know, mic drop? I don't know. What do you do when you get done with a talk sometimes? And I grew up in some Baptist cultures, and I don't know, for whatever it was worth, I always just really, even as a kid, when there was a responsive reading, I don't know why that just worked for me. I think it was because I actually understood maybe what to do in that moment with all the high church experience or whatnot. I was thinking, you know, so much of this series is rooted in where we have landed as a community in our understanding around this particular idea, liberation. And so this morning, instead of reading it, sort of praying it, I want to invite you to stand. You can go ahead and stand if you don't mind. And we've kind of turned this statement into a prayer. We've turned this idea into a responsive reading. And so I'm going to read a line, and then I was hoping together you would respond in where it's emboldened, where it says response, and just see what God might have for us in all of this morning. And so God, liberation, it's complex, you know, it resides at the intersection of so many things. God, if liberation resides at the intersection of living in the world as it actually is, but loving as if we believe a different world is possible. Yeah. If liberation means prioritizing the truth lived on the margins, because too often it's the powerful who tell the stories of history. If liberation means differentiating between the unjust and dehumanizing narratives that enslave and the people who hold them. Yeah. If liberation means working to dismantle those narratives, convinced that liberation is first for the oppressed, but also for the oppressor. Yeah. We're going to need a lot of that, right? And finally, God, liberation, at least from where we think we sit right now, if liberation means our actions are guided by your Spirit and the legacy and the leadership of those on the margins who have been struggling for liberation for centuries, God, liberation for those whose lament informs our humility, but for whose joyful resistance in the face of injustice animates our hope. Amen.